Funds Speakers Bureau.
Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone joining today, or this evening, I should say. I'm looking forward to discussing an impressively researched account of the roughly 1 million displaced persons who found themselves stranded in Germany after the end of the war. I look forward to an insightful conversation as David and Steven guide us along the story not yet known until now. It's an honor to introduce Steven Shalowitz, our host. Steven is the host of Jewish National Fund's Israelcast and the Reading Series, and also the One Way Ticket Show podcast. He's a JNF New York board member and on JNF's social media committee, and invites you to connect with him on all social media at Steven Shalowitz. David Nasaw is the author of The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War, published by Penguin Press in 2020. The Patriarch, selected by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of the year, and a 2013 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography, Andrew Carnegie, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, the recipient of the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize, and a 2007 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography. There's more. The Chief, which was which was awarded the Bancroft Prize for History and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize for Nonfiction. He's a past president of the Society of American Historians, and until 2019, he served as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Junior Professor of History at the SUNY Graduate Center. Steven and David, thank you. I turn the program over to you.
All right, thanks so much for that, Sarah. And David, it's great to see you again and to speak with you. And really, I'm so looking forward to diving into the book. Once again, it's called The Last Million, and I recommend it to everybody who has not yet picked up a copy. It is really one of the most brilliant books that I've read in the recent past. And we've had some stellar books here featured on the series, but as a history buff, this was just a remarkable read. So I really have to congratulate you, David, on it. For everybody that's joining us right now, we're gonna be in conversation for about 40-ish minutes or so. And then David has very kindly agreed to stay after school for about another 20 minutes or so. And as Sarah and Dan both said, that we are gonna be fielding questions. I got plenty of my own from the book, but feel free to leave them in the chat. And really, David, I just want to begin with you really at the very beginning. If you can just describe for those that are joining us here on the call now, describe who the last million were, who made up the groups of the last million.
Certainly, and thank you for those kind words. When the war was over in Europe, when the German forces surrendered, there were left behind in Germany 7 or 8 million prisoners of war, forced laborers, political prisoners, concentration camp victims. Within weeks, all but 1 million Eastern Europeans had returned home. Those who did not return home, the last million, didn't do so because they refused to be repatriated or because they had no homes to go back to. There are 3 groups. The last million is made up of about 400,000 young Polish workers who were virtually kidnapped by the Nazis throughout the war, especially early in the war, and brought to Germany to do the work that the German soldiers who were on the Eastern Front could not do. The second group are the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, and the Ukrainians. They entered Germany in the last year of the war. They were not kidnapped. They left, for the most part, voluntarily. And why? Because 1, they did not want to live under communist domination, and they knew the Soviets were going to annex their countries again. And 2, large numbers of them had collaborated in one way or another with the Nazis and did not want to be punished for it when the Nazis were thrown out. And the third group, which was the smallest group in the beginning, were the Jews, the Jewish survivors. When, as the war came to an end, the Nazis were determined to leave no trace of the war crimes they had committed. And they raised the concentration and death camps. They dug up and burned the corpses, and they put the survivors on trains or into trucks or death marched them back to Germany, not to save their lives, on the contrary, but to work them to death in German armaments factories located underground so they wouldn't be bombed by the Allies. The decision was, we will murder the Jews, but the last survivors will die working for us, not from gas.
And we're talking about 20 to 25% of that 1 million were Jews.
Yes, in the beginning, there's a very small number. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, it is less than 10%, because the number of Jews who survived the concentration camps and ended up in Germany was minuscule, 25,000 to 30,000. What happens is that the number of Jews in the displaced persons camps rises dramatically in 1946. 80 to 90% of the Polish Jews who survive the Holocaust, who survive the Shoah, do so because they escape across the border to hard labor in the Soviet Union. When the war is over in 1946, Stalin sends them back to Poland, those who want to return. 200 to 250 Polish Jews return to Poland. And what do they discover? They discover that the anti-Semitism they had left behind is more virulent, more violent, more deadly than ever. And they are forced in 1946, about 200,000 of them, to cross borders, to begin the trek into Germany, of all places, which is the only place in Europe they can feel safe, in displaced persons camps behind barbed wire, protected by American and British soldiers.
And in just a moment, I want to talk about the anti-Semitism after the war, because certainly there was anti-Semitism, of course, before, but the virulent anti-Semitism after the war. I want to get to that in just a moment. But let's talk about what Europe looked like. And then before we also talk about the displaced person camps themselves, can you give us the lay of the land, what Europe really looked like when the war was over and how decimated it really was and the hardships that people had there?
We can't begin to understand the desolation, devastation in Germany. The American and British soldiers thought that Germany would look like London after the Blitz, with buildings here and there destroyed. That was not the case. The devastation that was visited upon Germany from the air by the Soviets, from the East, and the British and the Americans and the Canadian Air Force from the West was overwhelming. There were millions of people who were homeless. There was absolutely no law and order once the Nazis surrendered. There was no garbage pickup. There was no food delivery. There were no street signs. There were no policemen. It was a total, absolute chaos. And within that chaos, the last million refugees were rounded up so that they could be fed and sheltered by the American and British soldiers, and they were put into displaced persons camps. They were divided up by nationality. So the Lithuanian Jews found themselves in camps with Lithuanian Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, who in many ways might have been their guards at Buchenwald, at Dachau, at Auschwitz. The Ukrainian Jews, again, a tiny number, found themselves with the Ukrainians who had attempted to eliminate them. And that was the case for the first couple months after liberation.
Right, so it was victims together with the perpetrators in many cases were all lumped together. And then eventually they were all divided out. So the Jews had their separate camps, their separate displaced person camps. And if you can just real briefly, David, share the physical structures of these camps, because in many cases they were the former concentration camps.
Yeah, and the Allies took over hotels. They took over German barracks. They took over entire towns. They took over camps that had been used to house the refugees, the Jews and the political prisoners. There were literally hundreds of camps, some with 5,000 to 6,000 displaced persons, some with less than 100, all over Germany, most of them in the region of Bavaria. And after the summer of 1945, they were separated out. So the Latvians had their own camps, and the Ukrainians had their own camps, and the Jews had their own camps, thank God.
Right. David, there's a quote here that I want to read for everyone that's joining us right now. And it really talks about this sentiment amongst the Jewish survivors on VE Day and during that time. And I'm going to read it here. It's a little bit lengthy, so bear with me. You wrote here, quote, on May 8th, Hadassah Rosensaft recalled in her memoir, quote, the war in Europe ended. I have often been asked how we felt on that day. Of course, we were glad to hear the news of the Allied victory, but we in Belsen did not celebrate on that day. For years, I've seen a film on television showing the world's reaction to the end of the war. In Times Square, New York, in the streets of London and Paris, people were dancing, singing, crying, embracing each other. They were filled with joy that their dear ones would soon come home. Whenever I see that film, I cry. We in Belsen did not dance on that day. We had nothing to be hopeful for. Nobody was waiting for us anywhere. We were alone and abandoned. And I want you to respond to that and the sentiment that I'm sure was shared all throughout.
It was for the Jewish survivors. First of all, they were extraordinarily frail. Mm-hmm. There were no children. Most of them were between 30 and 45. It was a bizarre community because the elderly had been slaughtered and the young had been slaughtered. But the survivors did not wallow in self-pity. They picked themselves up. It is a remarkable story. They picked themselves up and they said, we will not let Hitler win. We will revive, we will rehabilitate, we will people the Jewish community once again. And with the help of American, mostly American, and British charitable organizations who sent food, who sent rabbis, who sent the supplies they needed, and with the help of all people, Dwight Eisenhower, who had been told by President Truman, do something for these people, do it now. The survivors sustained their faith in the future against all odds, and they waited and they prayed and they hoped for deliverance from Germany, the land of their murderers.
And it's interesting because they developed almost like mini cities, mini towns. They had synagogues, they had athletic events, they had cultural events, they had education, they had training. So they really tried to improve themselves because they knew that one day they would ultimately get out. Yeah. And we'll talk about the trajectory on how they tried to get out. But it was really like these small microcosms, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they set up in many of the camps little, especially after the Polish Jews came into the camps and increased the number of young people. They set up agricultural communes because they knew and hoped that once they got to Israel, well, they knew that once they got to Israel, they would need to work the land. They learned with the help of people from the Jewish Agency, they learned Hebrew in the camps. They learned the history of the Jewish people and of, well, there was no Israel yet, of the Jewish settlements in Palestine. They had boxing tournaments, they had chess tournaments, they had orchestras. Leonard Bernstein came at one point, he's a young man, he comes to two of the camps and he gathers together with the musicians in the camps and he plays Mahler's symphonies for the first time in years.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. They also had a number of journalists, Edward R. Murrow, for example, that visited the camps. And it was very curious because in the book you pointed out that in the reporting, Jews weren't mentioned, only the nationalities were mentioned.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can address that.
It's an extraordinary moment, one that I never believed I would find when I did my research. When Eisenhower opened up the camps, Eisenhower immediately got in touch. Eisenhower was the commander of the occupying forces. He immediately got in touch with Chief of Staff Marshall and President Truman, and he said, the world has to see this. And all the major newspaper editors, politicians, newsreel producers, and journalists were invited to tour Dachau and Bergdorf and the British Bergen-Belsen. And they reported back what they had found. But to my surprise, none of them mentioned the Jews. They talked in general about the political prisoners and the terrible things the Nazis had done. But there was no recognition as yet of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, that the Jews had undergone a unique suffering that the world had not seen before and hopefully will not see again.
Indeed. There were a number of initiatives in studies, if you will, in reports that were commissioned, that were enacted to try and assess the situation and what to do. And one of them was the Harrison Report. And I'd like you to weigh in on that before we start talking about some of the individual players, if you will, Eisenhower, Patton, and Truman. But if you can talk about, just in broad brushstrokes, the Harrison Report.
Yeah. Although Edward R. Murrow and the newspaper reporters don't talk about the Jews, there are attached to the army Jewish chaplains. It's an extraordinary group. There are Orthodox, conservative, Reform chaplains, all with congregations back in the United States. And when they see what's going on in the camps, they immediately write to their congregations. They write to the organized Jewish community. They write to their family, and they said, do something about it. It eventually gets to Henry Morgenthau, the only Jewish cabinet member. He goes to Truman and says something has to be done. Truman and the State Department send a Presbyterian law school dean who had become a Quaker.
From University of Pennsylvania, right?
University of Pennsylvania, a man who had absolutely no Zionist sympathies or interests. They send him to look at what's going on. And he reports back. The army tries to say, go here, go here, go here. He arranges his own agenda with help from Joseph Schwartz of the Joint. And he reports back to Truman. He says, we are treating the Jews, this is before they've been separated into their own camps. We are treating the Jews as despicably as the Germans do. The only difference is we're not preparing them for genocide. We have to get them out of these camps. And the only solution I see is to open the gates of Palestine to at least 100,000 Jewish survivors. And Truman immediately got in touch with Eisenhower. He said, do something about these camps. And he got in touch first with Churchill and then with Clement Attlee. And he said, Truman is saying this, you must open the gates of Palestine to the Jewish survivors. And then he said, tragically, he said, we're not talking about millions of Jews overwhelming the Middle East. 6 million are dead. We're talking about a couple 100,000. Churchill said, didn't answer. He was soon replaced by Attlee. And Attlee said, no, no, no.
Okay, this is a really good jumping off point to a couple of different avenues here. The first one is, let's talk about Truman and the Americans and Patton, and then let's talk about the British. The one thing that I was wondering, David, was because this cost the American taxpayer an awful lot of money, okay, and you point that out in the book. Was it that Truman really felt for the Jews, or was it that he just had so much else on his plate that he just wanted to be rid of all of this?
It's a great question. Truman was an astute politician, and he learned fast, and he was smart as a whip. And he believed that there was no way to get through Congress, a Congress dominated by Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans, a change in the immigration laws to let in any displaced persons and any Jews. Knowing that he wasn't going to get the Jews into the United States, he put all his marbles into pressuring the British to open Palestine to the Jews. Yes, he cared about the humanitarian side of the refugee crisis, but not enough to get out in front in 1946 and 1947 or in 1948 and say to the American public, we as a people owe the Jews a place of refuge. That he was not going to do.
Right, because I want to come back to that point, because that was one of the most salient points of the book, that the Jews were caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, they couldn't go to Israel or Palestine at that time. They couldn't go to the United States. No country wanted them, and on and on. So they were really, really stuck there. And I want to come back to that point in just a moment. Can we talk about Patton, though, General Patton? Because he said some absolutely vile things in this book about the Jews.
But you know what is, it's true, but he wrote it in his diary, and his diaries were collected and his diaries were printed. We don't know how many other people were saying the same things. Hopefully no one was as vicious and vehement and anti-Semite as Patton. Let me read what he says in his diary. And this is in response to Harrison. Harrison comes over, goes to the camps and says to Truman, the situation of the Jews is deplorable. And in his diary, Patton says, Harrison is ignorant of the fact that if the Jews were not kept under guard by American soldiers, they would not stay in the camps, would spread over the country like locusts, and would eventually have to be rounded up after quite a few of them had been shot and quite a few Germans murdered and pillaged. Evidently, the view started by Morgenthau and Baruch of a Semitic revenge against Germans is still working. Somehow Patton is saying that the Jews are going to go pillage and murder Germans, which there was no evidence of displaced persons doing. But then he goes on. Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person, and he's talking about the Jew, is a human being, which he is not. And that applies particularly to the Jews who were lower than animals. Enough. I mean, he goes on from there. The language is just execrable. When Eisenhower visits on one of the camps on Yom Kippur and in solidarity goes into the service, Patton says, quote, we entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking bunch of humanity I have ever seen. The smell was so terrible that I almost fainted, and actually about 3 hours later lost my lunch as a result of remembering it. This is the esteemed General Patton.
I know. It's and I'm glad that we're bringing it up so that people know about this. Now, David, I want to talk about the British, but before that, we do have some people in the chat who have weighed in. And first of all, several people have already bought the book. Lauren Lizzerbram said she just purchased it. Lauren, I know you're going to love it. Faye Shepard said, I have the book. It's enlightening. And then Rachel Shankman wrote in to say, thank you so much for your extraordinary book. I was born in Landsberg DP camp and learned so much from your book. The Last Million was our selection for our book club in Memphis, Tennessee, and enabled us to have a deep, nuanced conversation. So that's from Rachel Shankman. And then we have a question from Janice, who wrote in. She's questioning the age. She wrote, most of them were 30 to 40. I'm surprised to hear this, as I believe most of the survivors were early 20s and mid 20s. There were survivors in their 30s and 40s, but I think the majority were in their 20s, or maybe as the daughter of a survivor born in 1926, maybe I was always just exposed to those survivors in that age group.
Yeah, I think she's probably, yeah, I cede to her. I think I misspoke. They were young. They were young. They were in their 20s. The oldest were in their late 30s. Yeah. And there was no one younger than a couple of teenagers and very few older than 40. So I thank her for that comment.
Right. Yeah, I think in the book you had the stats that most of them were like in their maybe early 30s, something like that.
Yeah.
Right, there's that. Heather Markson, thank you. She said, I just ordered it from my local library. And another member joining us, Esther, said she agreed in their 20s. So there you go. Suffice to say they were young. Yeah. And again, thank you so much to everybody joining us. And if you have any comments or questions, please do put them in the chat. We're going to continue right now. And for all of you that are joining us, so David and I had a quick chat yesterday about what we were going to talk about. And I shared with him a story and he said, please bring it up tomorrow night when we share it as it relates to the British. And so I'm just going to say real quickly, I had a great aunt on my mom's side. It was my grandmother's sister who was an ardent Zionist. And back in 1949, she took a ship alone from New Orleans to South Africa, then went to what was then Rhodesia, then to Cyprus, then made her way to Israel. And she lived most of her life in both Israel and the United States, kind of back and forth. I was extraordinarily close with her, and she spent a lot of time in Europe also. But she always told me she never went, nor would she ever go to the United Kingdom because of Foreign Minister Bevin. And you write extensively, David. You wanted me to share that, so I'm sharing that. And you write about Bevin and you write about the British. Yeah. So I want you to weigh in on the British calculus for not letting in more than, I believe it was 1,500 Jews a month. Yeah. Certainly, I think that's the number you had in the book, but in any event, it was a very small, limited number. Why they didn't open up the floodgates. And the bigger question that I have, and I know as a historian, you like to live in the land of what if. What if Clement Attlee was not prime minister? And what if Winston Churchill had remained prime minister because he was a Philo-Semite? Do you think that the equation would have been different under Churchill?
Regrettably, no. I don't think it would have been different under Churchill. Attlee and the Labour Party was much more pro-Jewish, was a staunch supporters in words before the war of the Balfour Declaration.
The Labour Party, you said.
Yeah, and Attlee's Labour Party, and opposed to the White Papers. What happens is almost immediately, the British realize that their empire is gone, India is gone, the rest of their empire is gone. They are from this point on a third-rate power in the world. Their only hope is that they can hold on to Arab sympathies, that the Arabs will remain in their camp, and that will give them, the British, an avenue to Arab oil. The British have absolutely no interest in the suffering of the Jews or of anybody else. They want to remain at least a second-rate power, and that requires friendship with the Arab nations. Let me read something from Bevin.
And also there was the Soviet element too.
Yeah, the Soviet element as well, but I'm more and more convinced that the British are exaggerating. They are using every possible argument with Truman to say that if you let the Jews in, the Jews, and this is a theme throughout my book, this is a new coded anti-Semitism. The British say that the Jews who want to go to Palestine are communists. And if we let them go to Palestine, we are creating a problem. We are opening up an avenue for the Soviets to enter. Nonsense, pure and utter nonsense, a big lie. But they used it over and over again. I wanted to read a Bevan statement. He says that he doesn't want, he's afraid of racial warfare against the Jews in England. And he says, I want the suppression of racial warfare. And therefore, if the Jews with all their sufferings want to get too much at the head of the queue, you have the danger of another anti-Semitic reaction through it all. And he says over and over again, in speeches, in print, in interviews, let the Jews wait online. Everybody suffered from the Nazis. The Poles, the Ukrainians, everybody suffered. Why do the Jews think they're so special and they need extra help? Why do they need to be allowed? Let them go home. Let them go back to Poland. Let them stay in Germany if they were German Jews. Right. It's blood curdling.
Right.
It's worse than Patton because Bevan is the foreign secretary.
Yes. I certainly have more to get to with you, David, but I want to go to our chat and the Q&A. Sarah Cohen has just pointed out that there are questions in the Q&A. That's why there is a Q&A, which I never open. And this one comes from, let me get through all of them because there's a great one here. Let me first go though to one from Mort Denlow. He said, I was born in the New Freeman DP camp. I broke into tears when I saw my parents. Do you know about this, David? He said, I broke into tears when I saw my parents' picture on page 335 of the book. Thank you for this remarkable book. And I'm going to open up the book right now to 335. Hold on one sec. Oh my goodness. And here we are. And it's a picture of this of a sewing workshop.
Oh.
How fabulous is that? So, Mort, if you'd like us to connect you with David, please, do you have an email address you'd like to share, David, or he can email me and I can forward it to you?
Sarah, if you could send to the participants my email address. If anyone has any questions or comments having read the book, please get in touch with me.
Yeah, we would love to.
Now, it's DNASAW, D Nasaw at GC for the Graduate Center .cuny.edu. D Nasaw at gc.cuny.edu. Oh,
great, and she's just put it in the chat, and I love how that circle is closed right now. So thank you so much, Mort, for chiming in. Judy Goldberg wrote, as a child, I learned how the British wouldn't let Jewish DPs into Palestine, but the Americans wouldn't either. We can touch on that in just a sec. We didn't learn about that in Hebrew school. Absolutely. And let's see, let me just go here. Hold on one sec. Now let me go to the Q&A here. I believe that's all in the chat. I love that from Mort. Thank you. David Kanarek wrote, I heard from my grandmother that she and her husband lived with Germans in Berlin after the war, but before they were able to move to the United States in 1949. Was there a program to have displaced persons live with Germans before immigration? And indeed, and if I can just build on that also, did I guess all survivors from the camps, did they just remain in the DP camps, or were any let out? Because certainly that there were people that never were in concentration camps that either went to DP camps or went elsewhere.
Yeah, once Eisenhower pushed Patton aside and removed the American guards from the camps and allowed each camp to choose its own police force to guard the gates. The gates were guarded to keep Germans out of the camps, not to keep Jews in. And the Jews went about their business.
Can you say that again? They were meant?
The guards were meant to keep the Germans out of the camps. They didn't want the Germans going into the Jewish camps, but they allowed the Jews to go into the marketplaces and to go into Germany to work if they wanted to. No Jew wanted to support the German economy, but the Jews, like every other group of displaced persons, carried on a thriving black market business because it was the only way for them to get fresh vegetables, fresh meat, and any number of other supplies. So they used cigarettes, they used some of the rations they got from the United Nations, and they went into the German marketplaces and to the German farmers and to the meat markets, and they bought animals to bring back and slaughter. They bought vegetables. They kept up a trade. And some of them moved into Berlin, and some of them moved into, now I didn't know about people who lived with Germans, but I'm sure it's true. There is every variety. The Jewish survivors are like all Jews. They're resourceful people, and they discover how to live in the camps, how to live outside the camps, but collect their rations as displaced persons.
Got it. Thank you. And then also in the Q&A, it's from Eidenlow, which I'm guessing is Mort, because it says that your parents were photographed on page 335. So I'm guessing only one person here has their parents on page 335. I'm guessing that's you. I have it in both the Q&A and the chat. So I think we've covered that. And thank you again. And I hope you two really get connected. That would be such a great story. And please follow up what that's like having that conversation. Barbara Finkelstein writes in, my parents were in a DP camp in Linz, Austria. Does your book also discuss the survivors in DP camps outside of Germany?
Yes, yes. It talks about the survivors outside Germany in Austria and in Italy, including Ray Kushner, the grandparents of Jared Kushner. Yeah, the grandparents of Jared Kushner are in camps in Italy. And Ray Kushner, the grandmother, says in an extraordinary interview, we didn't want to be there. We wanted to be anywhere else, but no place on earth would accept us. So they remained in camps in Italy until 49, 50.
Right. This from Bernard, he wrote in, the British claim that Jews were communists was not entirely without basis. The pre-state leadership was kibbutz dominated, and after statehood, it was not clear whether Israel would side with the West or with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's true, but that was not because Israel was inundated, invaded, and taken over by hardline CP members and Marxists. It was that Ben-Gurion was going to make the best possible deal to secure the future of Israel and to secure the safety and security of the Jewish people in Israel. So, you know, the first Israeli government was playing hardball. They were doing what was best, and they toyed with aligning with the Soviet bloc. The myth of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth is virulent. It begins with the Pope after World War I. Hitler picks it up. And then after the war, American congressmen, British statesmen talk in the same way. You can't trust the damn Jews.
Right.
Because they might be Bolsheviks. They probably are Bolsheviks.
I want to get to Janice wrote in, Margie wrote in, and Faye wrote in. I'm going to get to your questions, you three ladies, your questions, comments in just a sec. I just want to do a time check here. It's 7:42 right now. I like to think I'm a man of my word. I said we'd be talking for about 40 minutes. It's clear that there's still a lot more ground to cover. So David, you're okay to go for about another 15, 20 minutes, right? Absolutely. And if we go a little bit over, hopefully you have a beverage, adult or otherwise, next to you to keep your voice going there. Yeah. I have my sparkling Trader Joe's water here, so I might need to dig into that in a second. I didn't have a chance beforehand to grab a glass. I hurriedly went to the computer to do the Zoom because we do have a lot to get through. There was something really interesting also that you pointed out in the book, and I had never heard of this particular pogrom. I shouldn't say interesting, it's very sad and horrid. It's the Keelcha pogrom in Poland. And where I want to go with this is I want you to talk about that pogrom, and I want you to talk about this notion of anti-Semitism, because we talked about it in our conversation yesterday, of how anti-Semitism actually became even more virulent afterwards because the Nazis fanned the flames. And that you also spoke to me yesterday how just the language changed. So if you can talk about that whole arc of anti-Semitism after the war. And then ladies, I'm going to be getting to your comments and questions in just a sec right afterwards.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that there is no one anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semitisms at different places at different times. It uses different language, different idioms. And sometimes it's disguised in such a way that it's difficult to figure out that it is at root anti-Semitism. When the Jews return to Poland, they're not, some of them are told, go home, go away, dirty
And
Jews.
David, if I can just interrupt you, explain the time frame, because they returned because the Soviets had liberated Poland before VE Day.
Yes, the Soviets had liberated Poland in the spring of 1944, very early on. By the time when the survivors come out of the camps, come out of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, those who were Polish, large numbers of them, do everything they possibly can to go back to their homes to see if anyone is alive. And they go back to their homes, and when no one is there, or when they're told to go away, and there's story after story after story in Steven Spielberg's Show Up collection of testimonies, where a Pole will come to the door and say to the Jew, we thought you were dead. You don't live here anymore. We don't need you here anymore. The Poles had been devastated by the war, and they took it out on the Jews. They said, we are going to hold on to your farm, your business, your apartment, your house. It's ours now. We need it. We're not giving it back. And in addition to that, there was this undercurrent of anti-Semitism, of hatred of the Jew, as a race that had been stirred up, emphasized, exaggerated during the years of Nazi rule, and was now dominant, was now dominant. And of the 200 to 250,000 Jews who returned from the Soviet Union, the vast majority of them, within weeks, sometimes within months, recognized that there was no safety nor security in Poland, and they fled. In June of 1946, there was the Keelcha Massacre, which I won't talk about at length. I talk about it in my book, but it was a group of Jews, mostly men, who had come back from the Soviet Union, were single, found a warehouse to live in. There was a story, it's the typical, horrid anti-Semitic myth. A young boy said he had been molested, or he had been in there and he had seen the Jews drinking blood. A gang led by the police and with police support brought the Jews out from the warehouse and slaughtered dozens of them. And for many, 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 that was the last straw. They realized now that it could happen to them next. And they pawned or sold all their earthly belongings. They looked for escorts. Brika, the Jewish agency, had agents in Poland, and they bribed their way, most of them out of Poland, through Czechoslovakia, into Austria, and across the border into Germany, into the displaced persons camps.
It's just a remarkable, remarkable story. And of course, news spread of that, and you had Poles, Jewish Poles out throughout the rest of the country that made that decision based on that pogrom, and of course their own experience.
Their own experience and the pogroms.
And the pogrom.
There's story after story of the treatment of the Polish Jews on returning.
Right. And so, you know, I think a lot of times people think of the war is over, the switch is flipped, anti-Semitism's gone, etc., but it just festers. And as you said, it takes on a different language throughout.
Let me be, you know, absolutely candid here. As a historian, a US historian, as a Jew, as the children of Jews, as the father of Jews, I did not know this story. I too believed, and again, I'm a historian. I too believed that when liberation came, when the war was over, that the suffering of the survivors had ended. And it was not until I did this research that I realized that we have to rethink Jewish history. We have to rethink Holocaust history. We have to rethink the history of Israel in order to take into account the fact that for 5 years, the survivors in Europe were kept in limbo, in a no person's land, in camps, because no one in the world would allow them in. And it was not until the independence of Israel, in 1948, and Truman's endorsement of that independence, that the Jews were able to exit Germany.
Yeah. We have more questions here, David. Excuse me. This from Bernard Kabak. Can Mr. Nasaw speak to the reconstruction of Hasidic communities?
Yeah, the Hasidic, many of the leaders of the Hasidic community had left before the Holocaust from Poland and from Germany. Others, the Hasids and the Orthodox were the last to leave Germany. Many of them because they did not believe it was appropriate to go to Israel until the Messiah had returned. So the last remnant of the survivors, and I talk about this at the end of my book, you know, a couple hundred remained behind in Germany. The Hasids and other Orthodox sects tried to pull together their communities, and they did a yeoman job under great, great difficulty.
Right. I want to go back to some of the questions, comments that are in the chat. This one from Faye Shepherd, who wrote, "My mother went back to her home in Lithuania. She was asked by the occupants what happened. They should have killed you. They slammed the door of her home in her face."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a common occurrence, huh?
It is a frightening occurrence. It is a common occurrence. It happens over and over and over again in Lithuania, in Latvia, and in Poland. Most of the Lithuanian and Latvian Jews are murdered. In Poland, there are more Jews in 1946, but they leave.
Can you give any sense of today? I have not been to that part of Eastern Europe, but certainly if someone goes back now, what sort of memory, what sort of legacy is there among this next generation?
I visited Latvia and Lithuania. My family's from Lithuania, or my mother's family, Butrimonys, tiny town. And the Jewish community that remains is tiny. And many of them had spent the war and decades after the war in the Soviet Union, and then returned to Lithuania and Latvia. There is an attempt to resurrect a Jewish community and memorials to the Jews. But part of the problem is when the Soviets took over Latvia and Lithuania, they erased the Germans, killed the Jews. The Soviets destroyed the synagogues, the burial places, the cemeteries, any reminder that there had once been a Jewish community. Because the Soviets did not want any God but Stalin. And as a result, Catholic monasteries, Catholic churches, and all trace of the Jewish community was eradicated. So it is not till after the fall of the Soviet Union that Lithuania and Latvia, or the Jews, begin, and the World Jewish Congress and a variety of American groups and young Americans try to memorialize what had been. Vilna, I went to Vilna. There are a handful of Jews. There are not enough Jews for a minion. I mean, the young man who was my guide didn't like the Chabad rabbi, but it was the only place to be bar mitzvah. I mean, the community is tiny, tiny, tiny. So while they try to be brave, the Jewish communities, and they are brave, for me, it was just, heartache after heartache.
Right. Also, Faye writes in, my mother said I was born in Furstenhagen DP camp by Kassel. I can't locate it. Are you familiar with it?
Yes. Please send me an email and I'll show you how to get information about it.
Okay, Faye, check out his email address here in the, all right. And then also Janice wrote, my father, David Figman, Zichron Livracha, never was in a DP camp and instead lived for 3 years in the small town of Rotz, Germany, quote unquote, supported by the Americans, rations. Yes, and black market, as you say, there were a number of other survivors in Rotz, she writes.
Yeah, there were groups of survivors who would take over pieces of communities or apartment buildings with the help of the Americans, who helped vacate the premises of Germans so that the Jews could live there.
Got it. And then Israel Denlo, thank you very much. So we have two brothers, Israel and Mort, whose parents are the ones featured in the book here. So thank you for clarifying that, that both of you are joining us this evening. And we're very excited about that. And Margie, thank you for your joke. I appreciate that. I'm gonna leave that for another time. We had a little bit of humor here, but I would rather not disparage our friends in the United Kingdom at this point. I hope you understand, Margie. And then Malka writes in, will a link be made available of this program to share with those who aren't viewing tonight but would like to view at another time? Yes, indeed. It's on YouTube and Sarah will put it in the chat so you can copy it. A bunch of other points here, because I still see that we have a robust number of participants here, because there were a bunch of other questions, certainly that I had, David, and I would like to do it in a rather expeditious fashion here. And you started talking earlier about the anti-Semitism really in the United States, and that really colored our policy, right?
Yeah.
Here in the United States.
One of the most frightening parts of this book for me, of my research, was that 3 years after VE Day, the American Congress passes a law admitting 200,000 displaced persons. The law is written in such a way that 90% of the Jewish DPs are barred. Every Jew who had been in the Soviet Union or had been in hiding in Poland or served with the partisans and only entered the DP camps after 1946, that's 90% of the total, were barred from receiving visas under the Displaced Persons Act. Truman said it was the most disgraceful piece of legislation he had ever seen, but he signed it. He signed it.
Right.
And the argument against the Jews was that we can't let them into this country because they're probably Bolsheviks, if not sympathizers, then members of the Communist Party. And they are going to cause revolution in this country. They are a security risk. And that was repeated over and over.
But that was the veil. That was the veil. That was the lie.
Absolutely. It was a huge lie. It was a big lie. And that's why I say anti-Semitism is coded in different ways. After Hitler, in 1946 and 1947, you can't use the same anti-Semitic language that you used before Hitler. So a new form of language is used.
Just a couple other points then, David, really before we wrap. You know, clearly you're passionate about the subject. You've written about Joe Kennedy, speaking of anti-Semitism. You've written about Andrew Carnegie. What made you decide to write this book? How long did it take? And how did it change you?
It took me 8 years. I got a note from someone who's said, I'm a fan of your books. You write one every 6 years. It's 2018. Where's the book? So I had to write back. This one's taking longer than all the rest.
It's 551 pages, my friend. I know that because I read every word of it.
Well, I recognized that if I didn't know this story, you know, lots and lots and lots of other people didn't know this story. And at a moment in time when immigration and refugees and anti-Semitism were, and this is 8 years ago when I began, on the agenda, they were active subjects. I felt an obligation. You know, I've said that I didn't choose the topic chose me. And in doing the research, I had never thought of myself, nor had my father. We were supporters of Israel. My father was a great supporter of Israel. I was a supporter of Israel. But I didn't think of myself as a Zionist until I did the research for this book. And in telling the story and researching the story of the surviving remnant and of the way that the Jews were shut out of every nation on earth, it became abundantly clear to me that there must be a Jewish state, and that without that Jewish state, there was less safety and less security for all of us, including those in the diaspora. So, you know, I became a Zionist because of this work. And if I can just add one thing, I'll be quick. I met in the course of my research a man named Itzhak Lachman, who had been in all the camps as a young man and survived. And he met his wife in Dachau, and then they met again in Landsberg. And in 1948, 1949, because of a Jewish chaplain who wrote a letter to the forward saying, does anybody know Itzhak Lachman? And a cousin found him. And he was brought to the United States. And after the suffering that he had gone through, I interviewed him. He's 96 years old. His wife can't talk about the past because she lost her sister, her twin sister. And Itzhak looked at me and he said, it's a good life. He said, it's a good life. I have a wonderful wife, been married to for 70 years. I have children, I have grandchildren. I've survived. It's a good life. And that's the spirit, you know, of the survivors, of this extraordinary group of people that, you know, remains with me and will always remain with me.
And really, what's the, you know, I have so many other questions, but really just in the interest of time and everyone's, you know, things that they have to do and so on. We should probably really wrap it because you've left us on such a high note. What do you really want the legacy of this book to be then, David?
I want the legacy of this book to be, I want people to understand that an immigration policy has to be based on the best instincts of the American people, which is our humanitarian side, our loving, caring side, the people who are suffering for reasons that they did not bring upon themselves. That's number one. And number two, I want an immigration and a refugee policy that is based on fact, not fiction, and on hope that the immigrants will add something to this nation, which they always do, rather than fear.
Right. And the legacy for Israel, just final comment.
The legacy for Israel is, I think Israel has to, I think Israel celebrates the displaced persons, but I think it can do more to celebrate the displaced persons. And it can do more to keep their, blessed memory and their suffering alive. The Israelis didn't know what to do with these people. But Ben-Gurion said, every Jew belongs in Israel, and we will take the sick and the lame and the tubercular and the blind and those in wheelchairs, and we will bring them and nurture them. And this is a time when Israel is at war.
Right.
And that, that notion, that moment has to be remembered and celebrated.
Right. David and everyone that's joining us, can I go back on my word with something? Do you have a little bit of extra time, David? Because
okay, sure.
I have to say there's high tech, low tech, and then there's Steven. Okay.
Okay.
And I'm realizing that there are some wonderful questions in the Q&A, and I would absolutely love to get to them. So I beg your indulgence. Would you mind staying on even after school for a little bit? Okay. And for the participants, I'm going to try and get through these as quickly as possible. And thank you, because I'm just realizing that there were additional questions and they're really great. Esther wanted to know, is the Salzburg, Austria DP camp discussed in the book? Also, are you aware of here to find a list of survivor names at DP camps?
Yeah, you can find them. You go to the Holocaust. The museum has collected lists of names from all over. They're the Arolson, AROLSON archives, and they're located at the Holocaust Museum.
Got it. Thank you. And like I say, there's about 8 questions, so we're going to get through these. Anita Goldstein, thank you for writing in. She wanted to know, how do you see, whoops, this just jumped. How do you see Primo Levy's role in shaping the post-war refugee narrative? What a great question.
What a wonderful question.
Thank you.
Primo Levy is the tragic case of a displaced person who never found his way. And I think if he had stayed longer in a displaced persons camp and become part of the community of survivors, rather than returning home immediately or as soon as he could, I think his life might have been different.
Got it. Thank you. Cindy wrote in your research, did you encounter that some people in the DP camps did not return to their towns in Poland due to finding out that their friends were killed when they returned?
Yeah, there were large numbers, but the communication was miserable. There were a number of, look, the sad part is that at Auschwitz-Birkenau, when the Poles arrived there, they knew who was sent off to the gas chambers. They could see them. They could see the selection. And those who knew that their families had been slaughtered did not return home. Others returned home because there were community centers, Jewish community centers that were set up as soon as the Germans were thrown out. And people would post with, there were no Post-its there, with
right.
notes saying, if anyone knows, so-and-so, please let so-and-so know.
Right. Susan Reese writes in, this is a two-parter, David. As I listen to this and the horror, I'm reminded of the current business by which Poles profit from tourism to Holocaust sites, which is an interesting thought. And then she wrote a little bit later on, how can one visit and remember without profiting those who perpetrated such horror? So it's this whole notion of remembering, but the money's going somewhere.
Right now, I would not visit Poland. I would not visit Poland until the current government either changes or changes its policies towards the remembrance of the Holocaust. I think it is right to say that it was the Germans who operated the camps for the most part, but one cannot overlook Polish anti-Semitism and the number of Poles, not the majority by any means, who participated in the slaughter of the Jews. So I feel for everyone who wants to go back. But I could have gone, when I went to Latvia and Lithuania, I could have gone to Poland, but the atmosphere was such that I couldn't bring myself to do it.
Yeah. As I told you yesterday, my maternal grandfather came from what is today Northeast Poland. It was Russia then, and now it's, and I haven't been back. I haven't been there, but I would like to go to his village, his city. Sarah Parker writes, and my husband's great-grandfather was a rabbi at a shul in Poland prior to the Shoah. Is there any kind of archive that could possibly have his shul mentioned? It was one of the oldest and a wooden synagogue there. The shul was in Gombin.
Yeah, again, the Holocaust Museum is the place to look. Send a query to them. The Polish the Jews set up a historical commission. They collect all sorts of data, all sorts of narratives, all sorts of testimonies. That Jewish Historical Museum is taken over and becomes the Polish Historical Center. But a lot of the material there has now been copied and is at the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Great, thank you. Judy Goldberg writes in, and again, there was so much to go over that we didn't talk about this. What changed politically in the US to finally allow DPs as immigrants? They let in non-Jews as anti-communists, but what made Americans accept the Jews after 1950?
Boy, that's an extraordinary question, and that is a wonderful question. I don't know. The first Displaced Persons Act of 1948 was so outrageous that any number of righteous politicians on both sides of the aisle immediately began to lobby to change it. And the bill was changed. It was amended in 1950. But by that time, most of the Jews, displaced persons, had gone to Israel. They weren't going to wait 2 more years in Germany in the hope that the law would be changed. It's a long picture. From 1945 to 1955, I think there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism. After 1955, the environment changes and changes rather dramatically. That's the topic of another book.
Is that going to be your next book, David?
Well, a piece of it, yes.
I hope we don't have to wait 8 years for it.
No, I hope so too.
Simon Babel wants to know, can you talk about the role, and again, you touched on it just real briefly. Can you talk about the role of the JDC in helping survivors after the war?
Oh, the JDC is just absolutely remarkable.
But can you address something? Because at the very beginning, you point out in the book that the aid was not coming in.
Oh, the aid was not coming in, and the Jewish chaplains they write to Steven.
They went berserk.
Right, they go berserk. But it wasn't the problem of the JDC, it was the Americans. The Americans aren't going to let the JDC or any non-military vehicles or personnel into Germany until they have secured Germany, established mechanisms for housing, for sheltering and feeding the displaced. And they were convinced that there were no, snipers, no Nazi who were going to, wreak havoc. So the JDC is kept out. Once the JDC is let in, it does remarkable work. You know, God bless the JDC.
Indeed. And then I guess just maybe one or so more questions. But I actually have a very esoteric question to ask you before we get to Bernard's question. There was something interesting that you pointed out, David, in the book. I just want to check my notes here, that the blood type of SS officers was tattooed underneath their left armpit.
Yeah, yeah.
I had never heard about this before, and can you talk about that?
Yeah, the SS, the Waffen-SS, are the elite troops in the German arsenal. It's not the Wehrmacht, it's the Waffen-SS. They are Hitler's people. And to signify your entrance into the Waffen-SS, your underarm is tattooed with blood type, and it is visible, and it signifies that you are for now and forever a member of the Waffen-SS who shows your allegiance to Hitler. I tell one brief story when lots of Latvian former Waffen-SS members are let into Britain because there's a labor shortage and they're put to work in the mines. When the British miners see these tattoos, they go out on strike immediately. There's a meeting convened between the Foreign Office and the Home Office at which this situation is discussed. No one says, why are we letting in Waffen-SS people? The solution is that from now on, we'll keep letting them in, but we won't put them in positions where they have to take off their shirts.
It's crazy. And then we knew in the United States that we were letting former SS members here and former collaborators.
Yeah, a law
in the United States.
Yeah, a law is passed. I mean, if you take up arms against the United States of America, you cannot get a visa to enter the United States. You can't be resettled here. You can't become a citizen. Well, those laws were changed. Those laws were changed to accommodate the Waffen-SS, Nazi sympathizers, because they claimed over and over and over again that they weren't pro-Nazi, they were anti-communist.
Right.
Part of that is true. They were both, but they were very much Nazi collaborators and should never have been allowed into this country.
Indeed. Well, listen, we're going to wrap it up here with Bernard's question. Bernard Kabak, thank you for all your wonderful questions here. What has been the reception of your book, and have any historians pushed back against your narrative?
No, no. The reception has been extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. One Russian historian wrote in the Australian Journal of History that I didn't spend enough time talking about Latvian. She was married to a Latvian. That's the only criticism. I've gotten criticism from some Latvians and some Ukrainians that I charged them with being Nazi sympathizers, to which I respond, some were, many were not. But when the Latvians and the Ukrainians recognize that the part played by Nazi collaborators and war criminals who were Latvian and Ukrainian, then I am happy to salute them. Until that time, you know, I hold fast to my narrative.
Right. Well, listen, we just want to really wrap it now by saying an enormous thank you, David.
It's been my
for
pleasure.
a really robust conversation. We've been doing this since last June, and I have to say that you win the prize because this is the longest that we've ever gone, and certainly we can go for about another hour and 15 minutes on the book. Again, the book is The Last Million. It's published by Penguin Press. I can't recommend it enough. You made such a complex topic so accessible, so easy to read. It is an absolute page turner. And really, we want to thank you for joining us here in this Gen F reading series. And I just want to let everybody know, and David, hopefully you'll join us as well. Our next session is on April 21st, and it's this book, Is Resilience, is the book. So that's April 21st. It's not quite as long, by the way, as your book, which is good for me because I'm a slow reader. But I'm going to have to get started on this book, Lioness, which is our book for May 19th, because it's Women's month for Jewish National Fund. And this is by Francine Klagsbrun, who you may know, actually.
Yes, I do. It's a terrific.
And so hopefully you'll be able to join us for that one. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm starting this one hopefully this weekend because it's a long book. Really, we want to thank you a trillion, David. Thanks so much for joining us. And we want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And once again, this conversation will be available online. And have a great evening and wishing everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach Pesach.
Thank you.
Hi, David. Hi.
You want me to stay on?
I think Steven wanted you to stay on, but there's still a few people on, so maybe that's why. And he popped off, and my offices are closing, and they're kicking me out. They're kicking me out. So I think yeah.
Tell Steven I didn't have a chance. I have done dozens and dozens and dozens of these, and this was by far the best. He was the best interviewer, and the questions and the way he fielded them made it even better an experience for me, and I hope for everybody else.
Amazing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, David. He might be in touch to interview you for a podcast, so don't give too many compliments. We might use you a little bit more. Thank you so much. Okay, until next time. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Now.